By 1918, 11 major motion picture studios operated along a 2-mile stretch of cliffs in Fort Lee, New Jersey, not California, New Jersey. A decade earlier, the town now credited with inventing the movie industry was still orchard land, and Hollywood itself was little more than a train stop surrounded by oranges. Universal was here. Fox was here. So were Mary Pickford, Theda Bara, and a family of actors named Barrymore, all working within a few hundred yards of the Hudson River. Today, that same 2 miles holds condominium towers and the eastern anchorage of the George Washington Bridge. No studio standing, no soundstage, barely a plaque bolted to a sidewalk. What follows is the record of how those 2 miles built an industry and how easily, once conditions changed, that industry decided to leave it behind entirely. Chapter 1. The Cliffs and the Trust. The Palisades rise nearly 300 feet above the Hudson River, a sheer wall of basalt running north from the New Jersey shore across from Upper Manhattan. Point a camera at them and they become almost anything. Tilt up and they read as Wyoming Canyon country. Frame them tight against a painted sky and they pass for the Alps. Shoot along the water's edge at dusk and they become an ocean cliffside 1,000 miles from any ocean. A production could reach them from a Manhattan studio office in under an hour. A short train ride, a 5-minute ferry crossing, and a company was standing at the foot of a landscape that could double for almost anywhere on Earth. The crossing itself amounted to a daily rehearsal for the industry that would grow up around it, though rehearsal overstates what was, at bottom, a short walk followed by a shorter wait. Ferries left the Manhattan slips on a schedule measured in minutes, boats built for coal barges and commuters rather than tripods and arc lamps, so that a crew hauling equipment down to the dock competed for deck space with grocers, laborers, and Sunday excursionists bound for nothing more cinematic than a picnic on the Jersey side. Once across, a company still had ground to cover. A climb up from the landing, past the boathouses and the first orchards, before the cliffs opened into view. None of it was engineered for filmmaking. It simply happened to work. A studio built anywhere else on the eastern seaboard would have needed a rail spur, a purpose-built road, some investment in infrastructure that Fort Lee's accident of geography made unnecessary. Here, an existing commuter route did the job. In 1904, the land behind those cliffs had nothing to do with any of that. Fort Lee incorporated as its own borough that year, a rural crossroads of orchards and farmland, a place where a stranger with a camera would have drawn more curiosity than commerce. Nothing about it suggested an industry was coming. What it had was proximity, and for the moment, proximity was dormant capital. By 1908, a different geography was hardening in Manhattan, one made of patents rather than cliffs. Thomas Edison pooled his film patents that year with Biograph, Vitagraph, Essanay, Laemmle, Lubin, Méliès, and Pathé, along with Eastman Kodak, to form the Motion Picture Patents Company. Within the trade, it needed no fuller name. Everyone simply called it the Trust. Through licensing fees alone, it claimed control of every camera, every projector, and every reel of raw film stock sold in the United States. A chokehold on the physical machinery of an industry that did not yet know what it was. Filmmakers who refused to pay found their equipment seized, their sets raided by investigators. The Trust kept on retainer for exactly that purpose. The message was not subtle. Make pictures on Edison's terms, or do not make them at all. A year before the Trust formalized that grip, one company had already found a way around it. In 1907, the Laemmle Company began sending crews across the Hudson to shoot at Fort Lee. Drawn by the cliffs, certainly, but drawn more by what stood between those cliffs and 14th Street. A ferry ride was not much distance. It was, however, enough. Enough water and jurisdiction, enough delay in response time, to let an independent crew set up, shoot, and strike before anyone from the Trust's Manhattan offices could cross the river to stop them. 2 years later, one company decided a ferry ride was not going to be enough anymore. In 1909, Danke Wans Forking Mines, the independent Champion Film Company, built Fort Lee's first permanent studio. Not a rented barn, not a borrowed field, but a fixed structure, standing in open defiance of a monopoly still consolidating its power a few miles away. It was a statement disguised as a construction project. Champion was not hiding from the trust. It was daring the trust to come and find it. What made Fort Lee valuable was never really the scenery. Manhattan had back lots. Connecticut had hills. What Fort Lee had was the one thing no amount of scenery could substitute for: distance from a monopoly headquartered across the water, measured not in miles, but in the length of a ferry crossing. That distance was about to start attracting company. Chapter 2. The Man Who Wouldn't Pay the Toll. Karl Laemmle was a German-born former dry goods store manager who had spent nearly 2 decades behind ledger books before a Nickelodeon ever entered his life. Born in Laufheim in 1867, he emigrated alone at 17, worked his way through a string of Midwestern clerking jobs, and by 1906 was running a 5-cent picture show in Chicago called The White Front. He arrived at Fort Lee in 1909, when the town had exactly one permanent studio standing. Champions, finished only months earlier, and no obvious reason to expect a second. Laemmle did not come as a tourist. The trust had already made an enemy of him, and an enemy of the trust needed ground it could not easily reach. Fort Lee was that ground. The quarrel started, as it usually did, with money. As an exhibitor, Laemmle had paid the Motion Picture Patents Company its weekly licensing fee for every projector he ran, a toll he came to regard less as a fee than as extortion dressed in corporate stationery. In February 1909, he stopped paying it. Within months, he had gone further than simple refusal. He had decided that if the trust controlled every camera and every reel of film stock in the country, the only way around that control was to become a producer himself and shoot on land the trust did not own. Independent Moving Pictures, IMP for short, was incorporated that same year, built on a business model that amounted to a dare: make films openly, distribute them openly, and defend the company's cameras if the trust's investigators came calling. Fort Lee was the obvious place to start. IMP set up on Champion's own stages, the two companies sharing space within the same defiant address. Below the cliffs, a crew could shoot a full one-reel picture, roughly 1,000 feet of film, 12 to 15 minutes of finished story, in a single afternoon, then have the negative on a train to Manhattan before the trust's lawyers had finished drafting a complaint. Laemmle used that speed as a weapon. He paid his actors more than the trust's own studios did, poached talent openly, and put performers' names on posters at a moment when the trust still preferred its stars anonymous, on the theory that a nameless actor could never leverage a raise. It worked well enough that within 3 years, the dry goods man from Laufheim was no longer just an exhibitor who had refused to pay. He ran one of the most visible independent producers in the country. Fort Lee remained his base. By 1912, Laemmle had stopped thinking like a man defending a company and started thinking like a man building an industry. That April, IMP merged with a handful of rival independents, Powers, Rex, Nestor, and Champion among them, into a single corporation called the Universal Film Manufacturing Company. The merger folded Champion's Fort Lee studio into Universal's holdings along with it, so the same stages where Laemmle had once shot in open defiance of the trust now belonged, by inheritance, to a company bearing his imprint on its founding papers. Universal was not the biggest company to come out of the independent movement. It was, however, the one built by a man who preferred to absorb his rivals rather than keep fighting them. That preference would matter later. That instinct, building rather than merely resisting, would follow Laemmle out of New Jersey entirely, though not for several years yet. For now, in the summer of 1912, Universal's flag flew over Fort Lee alongside a growing list of neighbors. The cliffs that had sheltered one defiant Nickelodeon owner were about to shelter a great many more. Fort Lee was just getting started. Chapter 3: Nitrate Row. Alice Guy Blanchet was a French-born director who had spent more than a decade at Gaumont Studios in Paris, running its entire production department and personally directing several hundred of the company's earliest fiction films before director was a job most studios thought to hire for. She had overseen actors, sets, and negative stock long before American producers separated those functions into departments. In 1910, with her husband Herbert Blanchet, she founded the Solax Film Company, the first American production company run by a woman. She arrived in Fort Lee in 1912, when the trust's grip on the industry was already loosening, and Universal's merger was less than 4 months old. She came to build, not to rent. Solax was already turning out melodramas, comedies, and the occasional Western at a pace that outstripped studios with twice its budget, releasing new 1 and 2 reel pictures nearly every week and building a roster of contract actors who worked exclusively under Blanchet's direction. That output paid for the plant on Lemoyne Avenue, more than $100,000 spent on concrete stages, a glass-roofed shooting floor angled to catch the river light, and a fully equipped developing laboratory under the same roof, so that a picture could be shot, processed, and printed without leaving the property. It was by 1912 one of the most modern production facilities in the country. Not a converted barn or a rented loft, but a purpose-built factory for making pictures. Blanchet ran it herself. Others followed the same logic to the same stretch of cliff. In 1913, the Willett Film Manufacturing Corporation began assembling property at the corner of Main Street and Linwood Avenue, laying ground for a studio it would not finish building for itself. Walk the 2-mile row by then, and the pattern repeated block after block. Glass-roofed stages catching the light the way greenhouses do, laboratory chimneys venting the smell of developing chemicals, delivery wagons hauling lumber and film stock between addresses close enough to see one another's rooftops, Solax on Lemoyne, Willett at Main, and Linwood, and in 1914 Peerless went up on Linwood itself. One more studio added to what would become 11, crowded into little more than a square mile of former farmland, 2 miles of river frontage claimed end to end. Fort Lee had stopped being a place films were shot and become a place films were manufactured. Peerless was no afterthought bolted onto whatever ground remained. Its backers modeled the plant on the principles Blanchet had already proven at Solax. A glass-roofed stage oriented to catch the river light through the working day, a poured concrete shell built to outlast the wood-frame barns still scattered among the farms Fort Lee had only recently stopped being. Trade visitors touring the row by 1914 remarked less on any single building than on the density of the whole stretch. Stage, within sight of stage, wagons queuing at addresses that a decade earlier had not existed at all. What had been farmland long enough for the orchards to still be bearing fruit was now, block by block, an assembly line for a product that did not yet have a settled name of its own. William Fox arrived by a different route entirely. His backing came from Newark's Prudential Insurance Company, an underwriter with no history in pictures and every interest in a young industry that was starting to look like real estate. Permanent buildings, fixed assets, collateral. In 1915, with that financing behind him, Fox founded Fox Film Corporation and took over the Willett stages as his first permanent studio, inheriting concrete and glass that an insurance ledger, not a director's ambition, had ultimately paid to complete. He did not construct a legend from scratch the way Laemmle had, or design a plant to his own specifications the way Blanchet had. He bought his way onto the cliff with Newark's money behind him. It worked all the same. By then, the row was dense enough that a single fire could reach more than one company's fortune. On March 19, 1914, flammable nitrate film stock ignited inside the Eclair Studios laboratory. The blaze tore through the building within hours and left nothing standing. Eclair's Fort Lee production ended that night in the ashes of the lab that had processed its film. Chapter 4: The Girl on the Cliff. By the time Pearl White reached Fort Lee, she had already spent the better part of a decade making herself hard to kill. She had toured with a circus before she toured with a stock theater company. Learned to fall without breaking anything on stages, built for neither purpose, and drifted through 1 and 2 reel pictures for smaller outfits before Pathé's American branch signed her in 1914. She was not a discovery in the usual sense, not a face lifted from a soda counter and handed a script. She had built the instincts on the road, intense and provincial theaters, years before a camera above the Hudson ever found her. That March, Pathé began shooting The Perils of Pauline on the cliffs behind the studios, and White did most of the falling herself. The stunts were real. So was the risk. Each episode left her one step from disaster, lashed to a rail, hung from a rope, stranded on a ledge above the rocks, with the resolution withheld until the following week's installment, and audiences returned because the picture had trained them to. The serial format was new enough in 1914 that the industry had no settled name yet for the device White was performing, week after week, above the same stretch of river. By some accounts, it was Pauline's Ledge and the drop behind Fort Lee that gave English the word cliffhanger. The word survived the studios that produced it. Fort Lee did not. A year later, Fox's biggest star arrived by the same bridge of ferries and highways. Theda Bara had been built by her studio's publicity department into something closer to a persona than a person. The vamp, the devourer of men, a name reporters were fed and printed as belonging not to a tailor's daughter from Cincinnati, but to a beauty born in the shadow of the Sphinx. None of it was true, and none of it mattered. In 1915 and 1916, she filmed Carmen and Romeo and Juliet on the Willott stages, and Fort Lee's main street filled with spectators each time a shoot moved outdoors. Townspeople who paid nothing and asked no one's permission, standing at the edge of the set to watch a manufactured legend perform. No one collected tickets for the privilege. A director working an exterior on Main Street contended with an audience he had not cast and could not dismiss. Shopkeepers stepping into their doorways. Children trailing the cables strung between camera and generator. A crowd thick enough by the second or third take that assistant directors were assigned less to actors than to holding back a sidewalk. Some companies worked around the onlookers, others worked them in, letting curious faces drift into the edge of a frame meant to read as a public street, because for the length of the shot, it was one. No fence went up to keep Fort Lee out of Fort Lee's own pictures, and for years, no one saw much reason to build one. Actors came for the light, directors for the cliffs, producers for both, bringing everyone they could afford. D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Max Sennett crossed the Hudson with entire acting companies in tow, working the same stretch of rock that Fox and Universal were paying to redress for competing pictures. While Fatty Arbuckle and Douglas Fairbanks passed through the same stages on their way to careers that would settle somewhere else. Nobody owned the view. Everybody rented it. Two names settled rather than passed through. Morris Barrymore and his son John took up residence in Fort Lee during these same years, not commuting from Manhattan the way most of the industry did, but living among the studios that employed them. It was a small decision at the time, an address, a chosen town, nothing that looked like history in the making. It attached a family name to Fort Lee decades before That name meant anything to anyone outside the business. By then, the Row had swelled past anything Laemmle had built alone, past anything Fox had bought his way into. Fort Lee was no longer becoming a filmmaking town. It already was one, and the whole 2-mile row was about to hit a peak it would never see again. Chapter 5. The Quiet Docket. Picture Lemoyne Avenue on a Tuesday morning in 1918. The peerless glass stage catches the first light off the Hudson before the sun has cleared the Palisades, and a block over, Universal's roof does the same, the two studios trading reflections across a street that is already busy at 7. Delivery wagons haul lumber and painted flats toward Fox's rented stages on Willott's old Main Street lot. A streetcar works its way up from the ferry landing, and the ferry landing itself is doing the morning's real business, unloading actors, cameramen, and executives who crossed from Duane Street and 127th Street before the coffee had cooled in Manhattan. The air carries scene paint, horse dung, and river damp in roughly equal measure, and under it, the hammering of a dozen carpentry crews building next week's exteriors out of this week's lumber. A decade earlier, this had been farmland, cabbage rows, and a few scattered farmhouses above a ferry crossing nobody outside Bergen County could place on a map. Now it was the most concentrated production ground on Earth, and nothing on Lemoyne Avenue that morning suggested it could be otherwise. None of it looked breakable. That was the trouble with the thing that had already happened to it 3 years earlier and 200 miles away in a courtroom that had nothing to do with cameras. On October 1st, 1915, Judge Oliver Dickinson of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania issued a ruling in United States versus Motion Picture Patents Company. He found that the trust, the same licensing body that had once tried to tax every camera and every foot of film crossing the Hudson, violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The decision ran to the length of an ordinary judgment filed among an ordinary docket, and it made no particular noise in Fort Lee. By 1915, the independents had already spent years building past the trust's reach anyway. Laemmle had done it. Fox was doing it now. And a court in Philadelphia confirming what the cliffs above the river had already settled by other means, read. To most of the men financing pictures there, like paperwork, catching up to fact. The trust appealed. The appeal would sit unresolved for years. Nobody in Fort Lee organized a celebration, and nobody should have. The convergence that mattered more, and that the men on Lemoyne Avenue could not yet see coming, arrived in pieces between 1917 and the end of 1918. In April 1917, the United States entered the war in Europe, and the draft boards began working through the names of the men who built the sets, ran the cameras, and stood in front of them. That winter, a wartime coal shortage reached New Jersey, and the same glass roofs that had made Fort Lee valuable, designed to flood a stage with daylight, never with heat. When unwarmed through one of the coldest seasons on record, crew did not report. Coal did not arrive. Furnaces did not run. In January 1918, the Hudson froze solid enough to stop the ferries outright, cutting the daily crossing that had carried actors, film stock, and money between the studios and the city that financed them. And that fall, before the last of it had thawed out of memory, influenza reached Fort Lee the way it reached everywhere else, closing the theaters that showed the pictures and thinning the crews that made them, sometimes both in the same week. No single blow among these resembled the fire that had ended Eclair 4 years earlier, sudden, visible, over by morning. This was slower, and it did not announce itself. A drafted electrician here, an unheated stage there, a frozen river, a shuttered theater, a name absent from the call sheet for reasons no one wrote down. Each one on its own was survivable, the type of trouble any industry absorbs and forgets. Together, stacked across 2 winters, they were something else. In Philadelphia, the appeal from Judge Dickinson's courtroom was still working its way through the system. It would take 3 more years to reach its final word. Chapter 6. The Patent That Couldn't Hold. The 3 years were still running when the answer came from somewhere else entirely. The Dickinson appeal remained lodged in the Philadelphia courts, moving through the docket at the pace such things move, and Fort Lee's attention stayed fixed on that one case alone. But on April 9, 1917, the Supreme Court in Washington ruled on a case that had nothing to do with raids, or gunmen, or cameras confiscated in the middle of a shot. It ruled on a projector part. And the party on the losing end of the opinion was not some faceless licensee, it was Universal. The case was Motion Picture Patents Company versus Universal Film Manufacturing Company, and the irony sat there plainly enough that no one needed to point it out. Carl Laemmle's company, built out of a Chicago Nickelodeon and a decade of open defiance, now stood as the named defendant against the very organization that had spent years trying to shut it down. The question before the court was narrow, almost dry. Once a patent holder sells the item covered by the patent, does its control over that item end? The court said it does. A sale is a sale, not a leash. Legal scholars would call it the patent exhaustion doctrine. Everyone else would eventually just call it the end. The logic underneath the ruling barely needed the language of law to explain it. Once Edison or any licensor sold a projector outright and collected the purchase price, sell for ikoskorsins, the sale itself was the compensation the patent was meant to guarantee. To let the seller reach back into that transaction afterward, dictating what film stock could run through the machine, or what a theater downstream could charge at the door, was to collect payment twice for the same right. The trust's royalty structure had depended entirely on that second collection continuing indefinitely, a toll charged not on the sale, but on the machine's whole working life. Strip out the toll, and what remained was hardware, a camera, a projector, equipment no different in the law's eyes from a plow once the money for it had changed hands. It did not read like a knockout. Nothing in the ruling named Fort Lee, the Palisades, independence, or artistic freedom. But the trust's entire business had been built on a technicality of the opposite kind. The idea that owning a patent on a projector meant owning a claim on every reel that passed through it, every theater that showed the reel, every nickel collected downstream of the original sale. Take that claim away, and there was nothing left to enforce. Not a ruling about who could make pictures, a ruling about how long an owner's hand could follow a thing after it left the owner's grip. What came after was less a battle than paperwork. In 1918, a federal court formally ordered the Motion Picture Patents Company dissolved. There was no dramatic final raid to answer, no last stand outside a Fort Lee stage door. A company that had once paid detectives to chase unlicensed cameras across the Hudson went out of business the way most businesses do. A filing, a docket entry, a name that stopped appearing in court calendars. The men who had once climbed fences with confiscated equipment under their arms had nowhere left to report to. The organization simply was not there anymore, which left the odd, almost weightless fact at the center of it. The danger that had sent men across the river in the first place, into the marshes, onto the cliffs, into a town most of them had never heard of before a lawsuit made it necessary, had not been defeated so much as it had quietly stopped existing. No parade marked it. No headline in the trade papers called it a victory, because by 1918 the war in Europe and the influenza closing theater doors up and down the coast had claimed most of the space a headline like that would have needed. The trust was gone. The raids were gone. The reason for hiding was gone with them. The independents who had built their studios on the Palisades because Fort Lee was close enough to New York and far enough from the trust's reach now had no reason left to hide from anyone. Full stop. What they did with that had not yet been decided. Chapter 7. The Distance That Mattered More. Freedom did not bring them home. It sent them further away. By 1918, the independents who had built their studios on the Palisades no longer needed to hide from anyone. The trust was dissolved, the patents exhausted, the injunctions and the process servers who had once haunted the ferry landings reduced to a memory of a fight already won. But the question Fort Lee had answered in 1904 was no longer the question anyone was asking. What made the town valuable had never really been the cliffs, or the light off the Hudson, or even the studios themselves, standing empty some mornings and full the next. It had been distance, measured in the beginning in nothing grander than the length of a ferry crossing, and distance, once the danger it was built to escape had gone, still mattered. It had simply started pointing somewhere else. Southern California did not need a monopoly to chase anyone off. It offered something the trust's collapse could not. 300 shooting days a year, no union scale to negotiate, where the Palisades offered whatever the weather allowed. A coal shortage could shut down, a frozen river could shut down. Gone too was the mud, the kind that had swallowed film crews every February since Calum first set a camera on the cliffs. And it offered one more thing, almost as an afterthought, that no one in Fort Lee could have designed better if they had tried. A 5-day train ride between the coast and anyone who might come looking for you. Not because anyone was coming. The habit of putting distance between the studio and the trouble had simply outlived the trouble itself. California just had more distance to sell. That was the whole trade. The men who had measured Fort Lee's advantage in a ferry crossing now measured Los Angeles's advantage in a continent. A decade of injunctions and process servers had failed to move them out of New Jersey. 2 years of sunshine did what the courts could not. Same idea. Different scale, different reason, same result. Fox moved first, expanding the California operation through 1918, while the Lemoyne Avenue plant kept running on habit more than conviction. Universal, already deep into the ranch it had built outside Los Angeles years earlier, stopped treating the New Jersey studio as anything but overflow. Goldwyn built west from the start, never pretending New Jersey was anything but a stop on the way. None of them announced a departure. There was no vote, no trade paper headline declaring Fort Lee finished. The shift showed up the way these things usually do. In schedules, not statements. A picture that would have shot on Lemoyne Avenue in 1915 shot in Culver City in 1919, and nobody at the studio called it a decision. They called it Tuesday. The independents had spent a decade treating the Hudson as a moat. Now the ocean had replaced it. 3,000 miles wide instead of half a mile, offering sunshine instead of sanctuary. Fort Lee had not lost a war. It had simply stopped being the answer to a question the industry had stopped asking. At the exact moment a better answer to a different question opened for business on the other coast, nobody had driven them out. Something more convenient had simply arrived first. The studios on the Palisades did not close that year or the next. The lights stayed on, the trains still ran 12 times a day from Manhattan, and for a while longer the town could still call itself the capital of American film without anyone troubling to correct it. Capitals do not fall. They empty, lease by lease, contract by contract, one picture at a time. The clock on that had already started. Chapter 8. The Inventory of What Remains. Capitals do not fall, but they run out of tenants, and by 1948, Fort Lee's ledger reads like an estate being closed. The last film ever shot within its limits wraps that year. A modest production nobody remembers now, filmed on whatever stage floor still had a roof over it. 4 decades of industry end without ceremony. No trade paper marks the date, no studio head issues a statement. The equipment goes to auction, the arc lamps are unbolted, the film vaults stand empty. 40 years, and it ends on a Tuesday. What follows is not memorial, it is salvage. The surviving studio buildings, brick shells that once held Griffith's cameras and Bara's costume racks, are sold off in pieces, torn down for the lumber and steel, or handed to men who need square footage and do not care what it used to be for. Sound stages become warehouses. Warehouses become parking lots. Some of it happens within a year of the last picture. Some drags on into the 1950s, one lease at a time. exactly as the pattern predicted, back when the trust still had lawyers and the town still had trains. Nobody in Fort Lee is surprised. They had already watched the erasure start once, 17 years earlier, on a stretch of riverbank the industry had forgotten it once owned. Because in 1931, while the studios were still limping through their final decade, construction crews break ground on the eastern anchorage of the George Washington Bridge, and the footprint they choose sits directly over old film lots. Steel towers rise, where stages stood. A 6-lane approach ramp is poured across ground that once held Fort Lee's earliest production companies, the ones that came before anyone thought to record their names. The bridge does not know it is burying an industry's birthplace. It only wants the elevation, the bedrock, the distance to Manhattan. The same 3 reasons the studios chose this cliff in the first place. Traffic replaces the thing the traffic was built to reach. Today, the only trace at street level is bronze. Small plaques, no larger than a dinner plate, bolted to sidewalk posts along ordinary residential blocks. Willett Fox and Triangle Studios, one reads, Solac Studios, another, American Eclair Studios, a third. Here stood the stages where Theda Bara filmed for crowds who gathered on the street just to watch. Here stood the plant Alice Guy Blaché, built for $100,000 on Lemoyne Avenue. Here stood the laboratory that burned one night in March of 1914, the fire that took the negatives and nearly took the block. Commuters walked past all 3 without slowing down. On October 15, 2022, a new building opens a few blocks from where Bara once performed for Fox's cameras. The Barrymore Film Center, 253 seats, named for the acting family that settled permanently in Fort Lee before that name meant anything outside the business. Maurice Barrymore came for the work. John Barrymore grew up on these streets. The name meant nothing beyond the studio gates until, decades later and elsewhere, it meant something to the entire country. Now it is set in stone above a lobby door a short walk from the river. The family outlasted the industry that brought it here. The Palisades still rise to the height they have always risen. The same gray basalt columns Pearl White once hung from while a camera crew coined a word for the fear of watching her fall. Bridge traffic runs across the cliff face now at the hour the light used to belong to the studios. Condominium glass catches what is left of it, floor stacked on floor above ground that used to hold stages. The cliffs were never the production. They were only ever the backdrop, and no one consults a backdrop before the show closes. They are still there, holding the outline of an industry that packed up and left before the town agreed to let it go. The river moving beneath them, the way it moved before any of this began.